When Yasuo first came out in late 2013, people were not happy with his design in the slightest. Widely considered the most overpowered and overloaded champion at the time, people often think of him as the watershed moment that gave rise to Riot's more modern champion design philosophy. That is, overloading a champion's kit with convoluted Yu-Gi-Oh! Power creep-esque abilities because they think it's cool. Little did we know at the time, he would only be the start, with champions having even more overloaded movesets than the Windshitter himself. Retrospectively though, it's kind of amazing how to this day, Yasuo still finds himself at the top of many players' hit lists, and his reputation precedes him, in a not so flattering way. For over a decade now, Yasuo is one of the few champions in League to consistently maintain a presence in the double digits, more impressive given he's one of those champions who perpetually sits at a negative win rate. Sentiments towards the champion have mellowed out over the years, but you'd be lucky to go more than half a dozen games without seeing him either picked or more often banned. While not as high as it used to be, Yasuo's ban rate history is noted for never really dropping off regardless of the meta. Normally, when a champion gets buffed or has a high win rate, they suffer a high ban rate for pragmatic reasons. But like I just mentioned, it's highly unusual for Yasuo to ever have a win rate above 50%, so what makes him so uniquely targeted? In today's episode of Permanently Banned, we'll be investigating an old friend. It's been a while since I made a permanently banned episode, so let's recap what are the key factors that decide if a champion is ban worthy or not. Everyone has their own personal demon they never wish to play against, either for the sake of matchup or because they just find the experience unpleasant. For example, Riven means my target ban Renekton, not because he's a worse matchup, but just so they don't have to play extremely passive during laning phase and bide their time. Another common ban might be Soraka and Pyke. Pyke's playstyle naturally poses a major threat to Soraka. Champions who get banned on a frequent basis are done so because they possess one or more attributes that fundamentally shut down a wide range of champions, or they play in such a way that even if they're not the strongest or most dangerous pick of their respective role, they prevent you from navigating the game in a way that's comfortable. In essence, people ban champions that don't let them play the game the way they want to. That's reason number one, and the more practical reason behind Yasuo's consistently high ban rate. While you can easily point blame at any aspect of his game, probably the most critical aspect of our collective hatred towards Yasuo is the existence of Wind Wall. 11 years later, and it still fits within the majority of players' most disliked abilities of all time. Wind Wall projects a line in whatever direction Yasuo wants that holds in place for 4 seconds. Any projectile that comes in contact with the wall, regardless of what direction it comes from, is instantly destroyed. At higher ranks, Wind Wall grows wide enough to cover entire entry and exit points throughout the jungle. While not the first nor last of its kind, Wind Wall is without question the strongest of the 3 projectile destroying abilities in the game. It's also the least balanced. Braum's Unbreakable similarly has the ability to intercept projectiles, only instead of completely destroying them, it just directs all damage and effects to Braum instead. All incoming damage from the direction he raises the shield in is mitigated. However, the effects are not. An Ash Arrow, for instance, would still apply the stun. Not only that, but projectiles must come from the side he's facing in order to be intercepted. Even though Braum can move about while holding this ability and even completely block the damage of the first enemy champion attack, it's objectively a downgraded version of Yasuo's Wind Wall in the realm of dealing with projectiles. Samira's Blade Whirl has basically the same properties as Wind Wall, only it covers a wide circular area, but it holds out for not even a second, forcing the Samira player to be more reactive with it. Now, we do have a new anti-projectile tool in the form of Mouse Rebuttal, but I feel like that ability isn't in the same dimension of categorization, since it reflects projectiles, not destroys them, and it also nullifies all damage in general, so it's more of an invulnerability spell, but I guess, depending on circumstance, it could be seen as a stronger version of Yasuo's W, but more inconsistent. Destroying projectiles is one of the most impactful privileges you can have in League, considering a significant quantity of attacks in this game are projectiles. Even if only one of a champion's abilities is a projectile, it can be an essential part of their kit, and having the generous length and detection that it has, Yasuo's Wind Wall effectively shuts down half the cast on its own. What's even more pressing is how long it stays out for. A lot can happen in 4 seconds. If you cut off the enemy ADC from being able to attack, 4 seconds can result in thousands of HP worth of damage and the possible effects that come with it. Blocking an Ash Arrow, Urgot ult, Ornn ult, Seraphine ult, think of the sheer number of game-deciding projectiles that get vaporized in an instant with this ability. Placed correctly, it can easily be the single deciding factor in a teamfight. I don't think we can quantify just how much pressure this can shut down and just how much people have to play around it. There are super ultimates that don't have the same amount of impact as Wind Wall. Seeing as projectiles comprise a substantial portion of all attacks and abilities in the game, not to mention some champions' entire kits are projectiles, it makes perfect sense as to why this alone would be a reason to ban Yasuo. It also happens to contribute to a more central point behind Yasuo's consistent ban rate. That central point would be his unreasonably high pressure floor. Just as champions have a skill floor and skill ceiling, they also have a pressure floor and pressure ceiling. Depending on the champion and the role they're playing, you can have a low pressure floor, high pressure ceiling, high low, low low, or high high. For example, the jungle is a high-pressure floor role on account of the team's dependence on Smite to secure objectives. They could be 0-20 and still be a required asset for the team. Likewise, top laners have the lowest pressure floor in that they can go an entire game doing absolutely nothing and still win. Champions inherently come with a pressure floor and ceiling of their own. Ordinarily, those at the low floor are offset by a high ceiling, such as hypercarries like Vayne, Master Yi, Bel'Veth, and so on. These champions are among the most irrelevant in the game when behind, but when fed, they're public enemy number 1 and must be neutralized first and foremost. Conversely, those at the higher floor are offset by a lower ceiling. You'll commonly see this among tanks. Champions like Warren, Malphite, and Skarner can rely on their crowd control, durability, and engage potential to provide value to their team regardless of how fed they are. But it comes to the caveat that you can only do your job so much more with extra items, hence why tanks are often considered the worst class for carrying games. Yasuo is one of the few champions in League with a high pressure floor and ceiling in that he still poses a credible threat to the enemy team even when behind, while simultaneously escalating in how dangerous he is with more items. Much of that has to do with him being one of the only team-oriented hypercarries in League. Usually when you think of hypercarries, you picture champions with minimal utility and absolutely zero team-oriented abilities whatsoever. Yasuo, on the other hand, has two, the aforementioned Wind Wall and Last Breath. Last Breath is notably one of the only abilities in the game that can increase the pressure of other characters despite not being its original intent, suspending airborne enemies in the air for an additional second. While it may be mildly inconvenient for your ultimate to not be accessible at all times, it's compensated for by being castable off any source that sends enemies airborne. With a target range of 1400, Yasuo can activate this from even a screen away. Why that matters is that anytime you see an enemy champion with the ability to knock up, you have to act under the assumption that if and when they engage, Yasuo is nearby ready to follow up on it. It's a mutual benefit for both him and the champion doing the knockup in that Yasuo gets a way in, while his partner gets a free follow-up on their attack. The Yasuo could be 0-10, but if say for example Diana is 10-0, Yasuo magnifies Diana's pressure by essentially behaving as a stun bot, and seeing as Diana can usually rush down enemies, it gives Yasuo easy access to further shut down the enemy backline via Wind Wall. He might not be doing any meaningful damage, but you can bet your ass the 1-second crowd control extension will ensure the rest of his team can beat down the enemies, and at the same time he can mitigate the pressure of at least 1 or 2 people on their team. That is the extent of Yasuo's floor from a team perspective, but it's also worth mentioning his floor from an individual perspective. Thanks to his passive making it so you only need 2 crit items to achieve a full 100% crit rate, he has one of the strongest 2-item power spikes in the game. The 10% less crit damage is negligible when you're cutting the amount of crit items you need from 4 to 2. Then you also have to remember, being a melee champion, Yasuo can take full advantage of items that typically benefit melee champions a lot more, like Blade of the Ruined King, Stridebreaker, and Death's Dance. In any case, with just a crit item and Infinity Edge, Yasuo starts doing upwards of 400 damage per auto attack and Q, far outpacing what other crit scaling champions can typically do during that time. It's what gives him a mid-game on par with ability casters and subsequently the ability to keep pace even when behind. What I mean by that is Yasuo can still pose a threat to the enemy team despite being a full item behind or more, or in other words, you always have to respect him. After all, he is the origin of the 10 death power spike. Yasuo frequently averages a lot of deaths in the early game due to being a melee champion with generally worse base stats than other melee champions, but in light of how much he can influence the mid to late game and how he has just as much pressure at 5 items as most champions do at 6, the idea is that by 10 deaths, assuming you can reasonably keep up in CS, he has enough to afford Berserkers, Shield Bow, and IE, and can start putting up a decent fight even against 4-item mages or marksmen. Admittedly, the saying isn't quite as prevalent as it used to be back when Yasuo bought Static Shiv for his first item, but it's still relevant to some extent. He scales so well and has utility that remains useful no matter how fed or behind he is, that he always finds a way to be a problem for your team. Manaless Champion means he can spam abilities, Q and E having low cooldowns means he can wave clear and maintain high DPS and mobility quite often. He has good 1v1 and split pushing ability while also being a dangerous teamfight presence. There's always something Yasuo can do for his team, uncharacteristic of a hypercarry skirmisher. Final reason pertains to playstyle, player base, and just plain statistics. Absurd as it may sound, players generally dislike the type of mindset and attitude Yasuo fosters in his players when accounting for everything we just talked about. His penchant and potential for 1v9ing coupled with the brooding, too cool for school personality of the character, and the fact that he's very obviously inspired by the Japanese samurai attracts a certain kind of power anime fantasy, and player connection plays an important part when it comes to character popularity. Zed is popular because the experience he offers is objectively very flashy and appealing. Yasuo is much the same, especially for the time he came out. He was one of League's most mechanically intensive champions with plenty of room for outplay potential. He certainly draws more attention than Kog'Maw, that's for sure. Expectedly, this leads to many players being inexperienced with the champion, likely contributing to Yasuo's perpetual negative win rate. When a champion has a consistently high pick rate, you can be sure a good chunk of it consists of players who are first timing him thinking they're the second coming of Jesus. It's a strange, inexplicable phenomenon that to this day I still can't figure out for the life of me why people do it. If you're off-rolled, or if your main is banned, your first instinct shouldn't be to play one of the hardest champions in the game like Zed, Kindred, Riven, and Aphelios. You should be playing easy champions like Malphite, Malzahar, Amumu, and Dash. Nevertheless, people do. Yasuo is often one of the most first-time champions in solo queue just because of how straightforward he is to digest. A high skill floor and ceiling to play at a reasonable level, but each of his abilities are easy to understand. Some people pick Yasuo and bet the outcome of that game on the 2 rounds of ARAM or normals they played with the champion on. I mean, I can somewhat understand why. Yasuo's a fun champion, especially when you have the opportunity to actually make it to late game. But if your goal is to climb, you should not be first timing champions like Yasuo. Although this is neither exclusively good nor bad. Good if he's on the enemy team and you can abuse him for it, bad if he's on your team and you have to deal with it. Adding on to that, reminiscent of other anime main character champions like Draven, Zed, so on and so forth, the odds of encountering a Yasuo player who, despite having abilities that work best in teamfights, has a team player mindset are few and far between. Players who main carries or feast or famine champions have a tendency to mentally check out of a match or openly express a desire to forfeit if the first 10 to 15 minutes of the game don't go in their favor. The team could be farming the crap out of the enemy team, but if they're not in a position to carry, they'll pitch a fit and rage split all game or soft int, which is especially problematic when you recall the 10 death power spike meme implying Yasuo players are expected to start the game behind and have to catch up later. Furthermore, the 10 death power spike meme, humorous as it may sound, isn't exactly something you want to quit your day job for. Conceptually, Yasuo can still bring tons of value to his team while turbo feeding, but it doesn't change the fact that he's turbo feeding, giving the enemy team an advantage that they don't need to have. Yasuo can get a 10 death power spike, or here's a mind-blowing concept, he can choose to not die at all. He convinces many Yasuo players, namely hard-stuck ones, into believing their deaths have no consequence, despite deaths being deaths, encouraging them to run towards the enemy team with no regard for their life and not realizing how much they're giving said team by dying 10 times. You can see how this doesn't exactly make for a good combination when you add a group of players who lack the mentality to play catch-up with a champion who has a higher chance of inting early game than actually being ahead. Also, of course, there's the empirical benefit of banning Yasuo. Probability-wise, even if your champion's worst matchup is, say, Quinn, you're only expected to find her maybe once every 100 games, so instead it might be more statistically efficient to ban someone like the 4 Horsewomen of top lane who get played very often. Yasuo's consistently high presence all year round makes him a worthwhile target for a general ban, even if you yourself don't care about him all that much. High pick rate champions get banned often because there's a good chance you're denying someone on the enemy team their champion, versus banning Yorick, where what are the odds you're in a game against the Yorick one-trick? Yasuo poses too much of a problem if and when he's allowed to do his thing, and the upsides of allowing him to be played on your team can also be cancelled out through a number of ways, altogether resulting in a champion who's just not really pleasant to play with or against. Don't get me wrong, I've also personally made the ill-advised choice to place my trust in my Yasuo mid and his select Malphite top, and was surprisingly pleased when he actually managed to carry. Few things are as enjoyable to watch as a Yasuo Diana combo or a Yasuo Aurel combo. Strangely, he's one of the most enjoyable champions to build a team around due to how impactful Last Breath and Windwall can be, and also on the basis that building around Yasuo is a great benefit for you as well. He's one of the few hyper carries in the game who can actually reciprocate the contributions of his team. All the same, the number of games where such an ideal scenario occurs gets totally eclipsed by the number of games where you have a Yasuo who goes 0-10 and single-handedly loses you the game. Matches where your top or mid last picks Yasuo despite your team having 0 knockups and then he misses every tornado in the game are the one instance where you'd have a moral justification for picking Yone over Yasuo. Besides Windwall and maybe the crit multiplier, I actually don't consider Yasuo to be that egregious of a champion design-wise. I think he has a really cool concept with his ultimate, and the idea of a carry having ways to synergize with his team can make for exciting duo combinations or team fights. But in the chaotic uncertainty of solo queue, a champion like Yasuo ends up being extremely volatile, and so people would just rather not have to deal with him at all. What do you guys think about Yasuo though? Do you believe his ban rate's justified, or do you believe that he's not as bad as people think? Feel free to share in the comments. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you love to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VarsFarum, join my Discord server, and check out my other permanently banned episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.